In this episode, we are continuing our reading of Roland Allen's The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church. Chapter 2. The Nature and Character of Spontaneous Expression. In this chapter, I argue that spontaneous expression on the part both of individuals and of churches is the key to expansion, and that the restriction of it from fear of its uncontrollable character, though natural, is disastrous. When we turn from the restless entreaties and exhortations which fill the pages of our modern missionary magazines to the pages of the New Testament, we are astonished at the change in the atmosphere. St. Paul does not repeatedly exhort his churches to subscribe money for the propagation of the faith. He is far more concerned to explain to them what the faith is, and how they ought to practice it and keep it. The same is true of St. Peter and St. John, and of all the apostolic writers. They do not seem to feel any necessity to repeat the Great Commission, and to urge that it is the duty of their converts to make disciples of all the nations. What we read in the New Testament is no anxious appeal to Christians to spread the gospel, but a note here and there which suggests how the gospel was being spread abroad. The churches were established in the faith, and increased in number daily. In every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not speak anything, or as a result of persecution. They that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. This was not a peculiar note of the apostolic age, a sign of the amazing inspiration and power of apostolic preaching and example. For centuries, the Christian church continued to expand by its own inherent grace, and threw up an unceasing supply of missionaries without any direct exhortation. Nor was the result of the preaching of these unknown missionaries the creation of a multitude of detached groups of believers in cities and villages all over the empire. All these groups were fully equipped churches. The first knowledge that we have of existence of Christians in multitudes of places is the name of their bishop in the list of those attending some council. There was order in the expansion. The moment converts were made in any place, ministers were appointed from among themselves, presbyter bishops, or bishops, who in turn could organize and bring into the unity of the visible church any new group of Christians in their neighborhood. Thus it came to pass that 70 years after the foundation of the very first Gentile Christian church in Syrian Antioch, Pliny wrote in the strongest terms about the spread of Christianity through remote Bithynia, a spread which in his view already threatened the stability of other cults throughout the province. 70 years later, the Paschal controversy reveals the existence of a Christian federation of churches stretching from Lyons to Edessa, with its headquarters situated in Rome. 70 years later again, the Emperor Decius declared that he would sooner have a rival emperor in Rome than a Christian bishop. And ere another 70 years had passed, the cross was sewn upon the Roman colors. This, then, is what I mean by spontaneous expansion. I mean the expansion which follows the unexhorted and unorganized activity of individual members of the church, explaining to others the gospel which they have found for themselves. I mean the expansion which follows the irresistible attraction of the Christian church for men who see its ordered life, and are drawn to it by desire to discover the secret of a life which they instinctively desire to share. I mean also the expansion of the church by the addition of new churches. I know not how it may appear to others, but to me this unexhorted, unorganized, spontaneous expansion has a charm far beyond that of our modern, highly organized missions. I delight to think that a Christian traveling on his business or fleeing from persecution could preach Christ, and a church spring up as the result of his preaching, without his work being advertised through the streets of Antioch or Alexandria as the heading of an appeal to Christian men to subscribe funds or establish a school, or as the text of an exhortation to the church of his native city to send a mission, without which new converts deprived of guidance must inevitably lapse. I suspect, however, that I am not alone in this strange preference, and that many others read their Bibles and find there, with relief, a welcome escape from our material appeals for funds and from our methods of moving heaven and earth to make a proselyte. But men say that such relief can only be for dreamers, that the age of that simple expansion is gone by, that we must live in our own age, and that in our age such spontaneous expansion is not to be expected, that an elaborate and highly organized society must employ elaborate and highly organized methods, and that it is in vain now to sigh for a simplicity which, while it existed, had many faults and infirmities, and however attractive, can never be ours. I must, of course, admit that, if that saying is true, if it is really better that paid missionaries should be sent out by an elaborately organized office, and be supported by a department and directed by a headquarters staff, if it is really true that our elaborate machinery is a great improvement on ancient practice, and that to carry the knowledge of Christ throughout the world, it is in fact far more efficient than the simpler methods of the apostolic age, then indeed I must acknowledge that to sigh after an inefficient simplicity is vain, and worse than vain. But if we, toiling under the burden of our organizations, sigh for that spontaneous freedom of expanding life, it is because we see in it something divine, something in its very nature profoundly efficient, something which we would gladly recover, something which the elaboration of our modern machinery obscures and deadens and kills. We must not exaggerate the efficiency of our modern, highly organized missions. In the year 1924 to 25, when a force of 1,233 foreign missionaries, aided by 15,183 paid native helpers, and supported by 603,169,000 baptized Christians, was under the direction of the most highly organized of our missionary societies, the CMS, the number of adults baptized in the year amounted to 31,329. That is, 1.9 to each paid worker, on the assumption that the 603,000 baptized Christians did nothing at all to spread the gospel. That is no doubt efficient as we count efficient work, but it surely leaves something to be desired. In Madagascar, for 25 years, all missionaries were driven from the island, and a severe persecution of the Christians was instituted. Yet, we are told, at the close of a quarter of a century, persecution, the followers of Christ had multiplied tenfold. Later, the missionaries were allowed to return. Mr. Hawkins describes the period, 1870 to 95, as a period of great development. The staff of all the missions at work in the island was greatly increased. Churches were erected all over the central province of Imernia, and the work was extended to other parts of the island. Hundreds of schools were established, and a theological college founded for the training of the native ministry. Handsome memorial churches were erected in Tenerife, on the sites where the Christian martyrs had yielded up their lives. A normal school and high schools for boys and girls were started. A medical mission was established. The organization of the native churches perfected, etc., etc. But did the followers of Christ multiply tenfold in these 25 years, or in the 25 years which followed the organization? That we are not told. If we seek for the cause which produces rapid expansion when a new faith seizes hold of men who feel able and free to propagate it spontaneously, of their own initiative, we find its roots in a certain natural instinct. This instinct is admirably expressed in a saying of Archytas of Tarentum, quoted by Cicero. If a man ascended to heaven and saw the beautiful nature of the world and of the stars, his feeling of wonder, in itself most delightful, would lose its sweetness if he had not someone to whom he could tell it. This is the instinctive force which drives men, even at the risk of life itself, to impart to others a newfound joy. That is why it is proverbially difficult to keep a secret. It is not surprising, then, that when Christians are scattered and feel solitary, this craving for fellowship should demand an outlet, especially when the hope of the gospel and the experience of its power is something new and wonderful. But in Christians there is more than this natural instinct. The Spirit of Christ is a spirit who longs for and strives after the salvation of the souls of men, and that Spirit dwells in them. That Spirit converts the natural instinct into a longing for the conversion of others, which is indeed divine in its source and character. Where this instinct for expression, this divine desire for the salvation of others has free course, there it exercises a most extraordinary power. That power is vividly suggested by M. Taine in his History of English Literature. Speaking of the causes which led to the Reformation in England, he describes the way in which knowledge of salvation spread through the country. Spontaneous expansion begins with the individual effort of the individual Christian to assist his fellow, when common experience, common difficulties, common toil have first brought the two together. It is this equality and community of experience which makes the one deliver his message in terms which the other can understand, and makes the hearer approach the subject with sympathy and confidence. With sympathy, because the common experience makes approach easy and natural. With confidence, because the one is accustomed to understand what the other says and expects to understand him now. What carries conviction is the manifest disinterestedness of the speaker. He speaks from his heart because he is too eager to be able to refrain from speaking. His subject has gripped him. He speaks of what he knows, and knows by experience. The truth which he imparts is his own truth. He knows its force. He is speaking almost as much to relieve his own mind as to convert his hearer. And yet he is eager to convert his hearer as to relieve his own mind. For his mind can only be relieved by sharing his new truth, and his truth is not shared until another has received it. This his hearer realizes. Inevitably he is moved by it. Before he has experienced the truth himself, he has shared the speaker's experience. To all this is added the mysterious power of a secret. Christian experience is always a secret, and the man who speaks of it to another always pays him a subtle compliment when he entrusts him with his secret of life. But when, as is often the case in the mission field, that secret is a dangerous secret, when careless speech may lead to punishment, disgrace, or persecution, when the speaker entrusts his hearer with the safety of his life, or his liberty, or his property, such confidence, such trust, compel attention. Upon the speaker, too, the effort to express his truth exercises a profound effect. The expression of his experience intensifies it, it renews it, it repeats it, it enlightens it. In speaking of it, he goes through it again. In setting it before another, he sets it before himself in a new light. He gets a deeper sense of its reality and power and meaning. In speaking of it, he pledges himself to the conduct and life which it involves. He proclaims himself bound by it, and every time that his speech produces an effect upon another, that effect reacts upon himself, making his hold upon his truth surer and stronger. But this only if his speech is voluntary and spontaneous. If he is a paid agent, both speaker and hearer are affected by that fact. The speaker knows, and knows that the other knows, that he is employed by a mission to speak. He is not delivering his own message because he cannot help it. He is not speaking of Christ because Christ alone impels him. Do men not ask our paid agents, "How much are you paid for this work?" And must they not answer? And does not the answer destroy the effect of which we have been thinking? One of the great virtues of spontaneous, voluntary expression is that in the effort to express to another a truth which the speaker has found, he not only renews the past, but especially in the early stages, he finds out his own ignorance of many aspects of this truth, and he is greatly eager to learn and to inquire further for himself. He searches diligently for answers to difficulties which arise. He is not an authorized and licensed preacher. He has no professional omniscience to maintain. He can and will confess ignorance and seek help. He is forced to think over and over again, what are the implications of his truth? He has few ready-made stereotyped answers, and he goes on, no doubt. These tend to multiply, but they cannot multiply at first without much real experience. Thus, the voluntary, spontaneous expression of truth experienced strengthens and advances the speaker. Nevertheless, we instinctively distrust it. "You know," says M. Taine, addressing his readers, "you know the effect of such speech as that." We do know it, but most of us know it rather by an effort of the imagination than by experience. If M. Taine had appealed to us and said, "You know the results," would not most of us have answered with no less confidence, "We do"? And would not our minds have turned at once to the rise of those curious and dangerous Anabaptist and antinomian sects whose wild vagaries exercised the wisdom and patience of sober, sensible men in their own day, and our own curiosity and wonder? When M. Taine says, "You know the effect," we think of men like John Bunyan. If he had said, "You know the result," we might have thought of that widespread knowledge of the Bible, of that sober, serious temper, that grave and orderly conduct, which put an indelible stamp for good on the character of our nation. But we instinctively thought first of heresies, schisms, party railings and disputings, the wild license of individual interpretation. If that is true, it is but an illustration of our modern attitude toward spontaneous expansion. It raises at once the question whether it is in the very nature desirable, and the instinctive thought in our minds has condemned it beforehand as an irrational method of religious progress. It is clear that while it possesses all those advantages of which I have spoken, it also opens the door for the unbalanced manifestations of a wild enthusiasm, and we, today, certainly incline to dwell upon the latter rather than the former. That fact by itself alone is sufficient to explain its comparative absence in our missions. We fear it because we feel that it is something that we cannot control, and that is true. We can neither induce nor control spontaneous expansion, whether we look on it as the work of the individual or of the church, simply because it is spontaneous. "The wind bloweth where it listeth," said Christ, and spontaneous activity is a movement of the Spirit in the individual and in the church, and we cannot control the Spirit. Given spontaneous zeal, we can direct it by instruction. Aquila could teach Apollos the way of God more perfectly, but teaching is not control. Teaching can be refused. Control cannot be refused, if it is control. Teaching leads to enlargement, control to restriction. To attempt to control spontaneous zeal is therefore to attempt to restrict it, and he who restricts a thing is glad of a little, but does not welcome much. Thus many of our missionaries welcome spontaneous zeal, provided there's not too much of it for their restrictions, just as an engineer laying out the course of a river is glad of some water to fill his channels, but does not want a flood which may sweep away his embankments. Such missionaries pray for the wind of the Spirit, but not for a rushing mighty wind. I'm writing because I believe in a rushing mighty wind, and desire its presence at all costs to our restrictions. But if that is what we are talking about, it is futile to imagine that we can control it. Let us begin by acknowledging that we cannot. If we do that, we may escape from the confusion created by those who say that they have spontaneous expansion in their missions, and welcome it and rejoice in it, and yet say also that they are sent to control and must control it. By spontaneous expansion, I mean something which we cannot control, and if we cannot control it, we ought, as I think, to rejoice that we cannot control it. For if we cannot control it, it is because it is too great, not because it is too small for us. The great things of God are beyond our control. Therein lies a vast hope. Spontaneous expansion could fill the continents with the knowledge of Christ. Our control cannot reach as far as that. We constantly bewail our limitations, open doors unentered, doors closed to us as foreign missionaries, fields white to the harvest which we cannot reap. Spontaneous expansion could enter open doors, force closed ones, and reap those white fields. Our control cannot. It can only appeal pitifully for more men to maintain control. There is always something terrifying in the feeling that we are letting loose a force which we cannot control. And when we think of spontaneous expansion in this way, Instinctively, we begin to be afraid. Whether we consider our doctrine, or our civilization, or our morals, or our organization in relation to a spontaneous expansion of the church, we are seized with terror. Terror lest spontaneous expansion should lead to disorder. We are quite ready to talk of self-supporting, self-extending, and self-governing churches in the abstract as ideals. But the moment that we think of ourselves as establishing self-supporting, self-governing churches in the biblical sense, we are met by this fear, a terrible, deadly fear. Suppose they really were self-supporting and depended no longer on our support. Where should we be? Suppose self-extension were really self-extension and we could not control it. What would happen? Suppose they were really self-governing. How would they govern? We instinctively think of something which we cannot control as tending to disorder. That we in our missions see comparatively few signs of a force so mighty and so universal is in itself a sufficient proof that there must be in our method or work some strong restraining influence. That we so often ascribe absence of missionary zeal to the incapacity of our converts rather than to that restraining influence is a sufficient proof of our blindness. That we at once pray for manifestations of zeal on the part of our converts and instinctively shrink from steps which may tend to realize it is rather sad than surprising. The force is indeed so strong as to be alarming. This instinct which makes for spontaneous expression is so powerful as to be alarming, but it is not in its nature opposed to order. It is essentially a social instinct. Islam, we are told, spread in Africa mainly through the spontaneous activity of its converts. But that expansion is not disorderly, in the sense that it is opposed to Islamic order. It does not break the Muslims into innumerable sects. It does not cast away the orthodox Islamic teaching. It does not prefer disorder and disunion. If the natural instinct is not opposed to order, still less is the divine spirit opposed to order. Yet both may be driven into opposition to established order. When the desire to express that natural instinct, that God-given grace, finds itself confined by the order of a superior authority, or by the conditions set up by authority, it is so strong that it can with difficulty be restrained. If men feel that they are acting in any sense against the will, implied or expressed, of authority, they burst all bounds, and then there is danger of the wildest excesses, for they begin by breaking down the only order which they know, and in bursting away from that which would restrain them, they express themselves in violent hostility. Yet they desire order. How little the spirit which creates spontaneous expansion is naturally opposed to order may be seen in the history of the Reformation in England. Then men received a doctrine of salvation, which gave them new hope, and they could not refrain from propagating it. But they were opposed by the religious authority of their day. Then, at the risk of life, they persisted in expressing this instinct to share a joy, this grace which seeks the salvation of others. They broke away from all the order which they knew, and wild excesses were the immediate result. Yet even so, though the movement was in opposition to the ordered religious life of the country, the wildest excesses were confined to comparatively few, and the great majority desired order, and in a remarkably short space of time, created order, even in schism. But perhaps it may be said that what we fear is not the free expression of this natural instinct, still less of this divine grace. What we fear is the expression of human self-will and self-assertion. These are real sources of disorder, and unhappily men are not moved solely by the pure zeal of the gospel. We cannot possibly open the door to an unrestricted freedom for the expression of the natural instinct and the spiritual grace without opening it also to the expression of self-will, and that we dare not do. That is quite true, but unhappily, it is also true that we cannot check the license of self-will without checking at the same time the zeal which springs from the natural instinct and the grace of the gospel. We cannot distinguish the activity of the one from the activity of the other. The motives which influence the action of human beings are very mixed. Anyone who has tried to analyze his motives for any single action must be conscious of it. Those who exercise authority are not free from mixed motives any more than those who submit to or resist the authority. We cannot then root up the tares without rooting up the wheat with them. The same action which represses an exhibition of self-will represses also an exhibition of godly zeal. Indeed, godly zeal can generally be restrained with far lighter curb than self-assertion. An exercise of authority sufficiently strong to hold self-will within bounds is often sufficiently strong to suppress zeal altogether. If new converts once receive the impression that they should express the natural instinct to impart a new-found joy, the divine desire for the salvation of others, only under direction they are in bonds, cramped and shackled, the zeal dies away, and the church is robbed of the inspiration which comes from the sense that men are being converted, and the church enlarged, no one knows quite how or by whom. The church is robbed, not knowing how it is robbed, but slowly there grows up a dim sense that all is not well with it, that there has been some restraining influence, and sooner or later the Christians turn upon their directors and accuse them of having in some way held them back. They do not know what is wrong. Zeal for the conversion of their neighbors is not in their hearts or in their thoughts, but it is the suppression of that first zeal, which was never expressed, which is the real cause of their trouble. The same truth applies to churches. Spontaneous expansion begins with individual expression. It proceeds to corporate expression, and if the corporate expression is checked, there is again a danger of disorder. The denial of a native episcopate, the denial of self-government, seems at the moment to be a great security for order, and for the moment it is. But it represses the instinct for self-propagation and mars the fullness of life. For the instinct must be, then, stifled. That it should be stifled is a grievous loss to the whole body, for it means stagnation, and the stagnation of a part is a source of poison to the whole. The momentary security is thus gained at a serious cost, and it can only be momentary. The instinct for expression is so strong that it cannot long be restrained. Then must be repeated on a larger scale the struggle which we saw in the case of the individual. The time which this process may take to come to a head is perhaps longer than in the former case, but the longer the time, the more serious is the upheaval. Here, too, it is not the desire for expression which produces the disorder. It is the desire breaking out against order, because it cannot express itself within the order which it knows. That, too, is grievous. It means the rending of the body, and that is a sore evil, and a source of evil to the whole body. The only alternative is that it should have free course within the order of the whole. Neither the natural instinct, nor the grace of the gospel, nor the self-will of man can be permanently eradicated by any external authority. Self-will is the natural enemy of order. Godly zeal is its natural ally. Restraint forces godly zeal into opposition to order. Sooner or later it must break forth, and, if it breaks forth in opposition to order, self-will and self-assertion appear as its allies and flaunt themselves in the guise of the deliverers of godly zeal. It is dangerous to restrain what cannot be permanently crushed. Naturam expellas furca tamen usque recurat. We are in far greater danger of serious disorder when, in fear of the expression of self-will, we restrain a God-given instinct than when we accept the risks involved in giving it free play. Yet because we can, for the moment, by an exercise of authority, or by our influence, or by the influence of the conditions which we create, or by an insistence upon law, avoid the obvious present dangers of freedom, we naturally tend to think this the safe course. It is said when God announced to his angels his purpose to create man in his own image, Lucifer, who was not yet fallen from heaven, cried, "Surely he will not give them power to disobey him." And the Son answered him, "Power to fall is power to rise." Lucifer knew neither power to rise nor power to fall. But that word, power to fall, sunk deep into his heart, and he began to desire to know that power, and he plotted from that day forward the fall of man. He fell himself, and he taught man to know his power and to use his power to fall. When in the fullness of time he saw the redemption wrought by Christ, he began dimly to understand that power to fall is power to rise. But he understood it crookedly. Hence, as Christ's disciples began to multiply and his own kingdom to be diminished, his mind turned instinctively again to his power to fall. If he could check or hinder the power to fall, he might also, he thought, check the power to rise. He began by trying to induce the apostles to bind all the Gentile converts within the hedge of the Mosaic law, and he was foiled by the boldness of the faith of the great apostle of the Gentiles. But ever since, he has sought to attain his end, striving to induce the servants of Christ to deprive new converts of the power to fall, by hedging them round with laws of one kind or another, in the hope that so he might deprive them of the power to rise. And men, knowing the terrors of falling and dreading the power to fall for new converts, are only too ready to listen to him, for he plays upon their fears. This chapter fits extremely well in relation to this season on simplicity. Alan even mentions the word simplicity multiple times towards the beginning of this chapter. And if you're paying attention, I mean, it sounds very much like what Eller said in the last work that we read, The Outward Bound. And, this idea of technique and efficiency, we're talking about, let's see, he referenced like the late 20s here. So Alan, hasn't gotten into Elul and all of that stuff, but he's now seen the First World War. He's seen industrialization in his generation or the generation before. Great industrialization, great organizations of societies with World War I and on the cusp of World War II within the next decade or so. Like all this modernization and efficiency is really coming on the scene. And if you listen to our propaganda season, this is also around the time how propaganda became public relations, that great work, and just talking about how everything started to be organized and this efficiency mindedness started to come in. So whether Alan has that big scope in mind or not, he references notions of efficiency here. He's talking about missions boards, and he's like, and we've got however many thousands of missionaries he's talking about, and all this money and all these resources that you're pumping in, and you've got to have, once you get converts, you got to have these Christian schools, and you got to have these institutions, and he's like, is it really the most efficient? He gives an example of, I guess, Madagascar, when missionaries were kicked out and they came back after a little bit, and the Christians had grown tenfold. And he's like, did we ever see that success rate in Madagascar with professional missionaries? And I think the answer is always, or almost always, no. Like, you don't see, just numerically, you don't see the same amount of results a lot of times. And qualitatively, probably, you don't usually see the same sorts of results. Does that mean that you shouldn't have any missionaries? Probably not. I mean, missionaries probably are a good thing at some points. But anecdotally, like, I know that the cost of sending missionaries is extreme. It's a lot of money. And there's a lot of waste that goes on too. When depending on how you calculate waste, but the flying back and forth to the States, and at this point, like, it used to be that you do it every 4 years, but a lot of people, at least in our organization, were doing it probably every 2 years. And there are reasons for doing it, on different time frames, but there's a lot of traveling. then anytime you go to like a regional conference or get together with your group and you're flying to another country, like there's a lot of expense that comes in um, with doing missions. And then when you come back to the States and you're itinerating, you're going from church to church, you're all those travel expenses and food and everything. There's a lot of money that goes into sending missionaries. And of course, some organizations do it differently. Some churches, if you're supported by one or two local churches and you're not traveling all over the country like missionaries used to do, right? There are definitely models that are more efficient than others. Nevertheless, it costs a lot of money to raise somebody up from a foreign country, put them through school to learn languages and, get all these documents and all the expenses that go into it, just so many. It costs a lot of money. And so to Alan's point, it's not really the most efficient way to do things monetarily, right? You want nationals who are going to do that in terms of just pure monetary efficiency, in terms of numbers. But then beyond that, what Alan is pointing out is that qualitatively, it's very different. Even if you are on fire as a missionary and you're going to share the gospel, it's just very different when people know that you are a foreigner and a paid missionary. You are coming over to another country with an agenda from the outset, and you can't really think critically, right? Like you just can't. You're on the payroll. There's no possible way that you stay on the payroll and you're thinking critically, because you have to continue to believe what you're believing. So you can't really ever hear an atheist out or another religion out. You can't hear anything else because you'd lose your pay, right? So you're extremely suspect, and it's hard to believe that you're genuine necessarily, because you've got these ulterior motives, you've got these vested interests that just make you a partial observer rather than an impartial one. So what Alan is saying is that, look, nationals really need to get the priority in terms of, in terms of getting the freedom to be able to become preachers and teachers and leaders. And we want nationals to be able to share the gospel over missionaries. We don't want professional missionaries to be over everything and controlling everything. He doesn't say that he doesn't want any professional missionaries, just it's not ideal, right? You want the nationals to have control. And not only because of the efficiency, but because of their quality. When they are a convert in their own land, and they're not on the payroll, they are going to desire to share their faith with other people. And so there's a difference, right? When you go as a missionary, you have an agenda, whether you want to admit it or not. People want to hear stories of of foreigners converting. That's what they really, really want to hear. They want to know about people who are converting. And so you have this agenda, whether you realize it or not, that you really want to convert people. And so you, in a sense, sure, you want good for all people, but you're also, in a sense, objectifying people, right? For your pay, for your notoriety. So people think you're a good missionary, and just because you're trying to accomplish some goal in their life. And that is extremely different from, let's say, a national convert who just starts to go out and share because they can't contain themselves. They're so happy about this thing that has happened in their life. And maybe you as a missionary are excited about this thing that happened in your life and you think it's good for other people. Great, sure. Nevertheless, you have all of these other ulterior motives that are present to at least some degree, and that just kind of muddies the waters. And to Alan's point, he's saying, I don't know that this idea of the Great Commission is really, it has in view to just go and send out a bunch of missionaries to a bunch of foreign countries. And there are, I think Joash Thomas, I was just actually seeing him posting some things recently where he talks about the Great Commission was not a part of like early church emphasis. This idea that we're just going to send people all over the place. It's like, yeah, the original apostles did. And so Jesus was telling the original apostles to go into all the nations. But that's not really what was in view throughout the early church. Like that wasn't something that they took up as part of their banner, right? Because when you look at the New Testament and you look at churches, it's not like you had some institutionalized, structured organization. It's just, man, where Paul went, he shared his love and his heart. And then the people in those churches just started to, like, out of the overflow of their conversion experience of what the gospel did in their life, they just shared, and now all of a sudden they're a church. And Paul leaves them pretty quickly a lot of times, and they're still a church, and now they're running themselves. And you don't have Paul who's like who's all up in their business, running the show daily. Right now, certainly he writes letters to churches, like Corinth is, a big one, where he chastises them, and then he comes back and is like, man, you guys are a little too harsh. Like, why don't you lighten up and forgive the dude? So certainly there's involvement, but these nationals, they're running their own churches. And the structure that we see in modern missions, where you have these paid professionals going out and trying to convert people, objectify people, and then on top of that, not allowing the nationals to, in the zeal of their conversion and their just experience of God, instead of allowing them to lead, to go forth, to be the ones who are sharing out of this overflow of love and abundance of the goodness of God. Now these missionaries are trying to micromanage and rigidly structure these churches. And Alan's like, what the heck is going on? Like, numerically, it's terrible. And qualitatively, it's terrible. So it's terrible on two fronts, that we aren't having the nationals head stuff up and allowing them to lead their own movements. He's like, so why is this such a bad thing? Because, well, for a bunch of reasons, but one, because when you try to constrain people, when you go somewhere and you try to constrain people, and this works for all types of authority, like governmental authority, parental authority, but when you try to constrain people and you make these rigid boundaries and you don't allow self-expression and you don't allow people to express to create expressions from what they are experiencing, then there's going to be rebellion, and they're going to rebel back against the constraints. And you see this a ton. Like, deconstruction is pretty much exactly this, right? You have these evangelicalism in particular in the U.S. It just has these rigid, ridiculous, sometimes legalistic boundaries of what it means to experience God, of what it means to follow God. And people are really pushing back against that. And now all of a sudden you've got this pendulum swing, because whoever set the boundaries, and whatever boundaries they set, you're gonna break through those, and you're gonna go far away. And it's gonna be crazy. Whatever happens next is gonna be crazy, like this backlash. And it's probably not going to be the right expression, but it's water trying to seek its own level, right? It breaks through the dam, and now the waters are going to be rising until it finds its level. So that's kind of what Alan's looking at here. Like, if you're setting up these rigid structures and you're trying to control everything, then basically when that expression does break forth from the nationals, it's not going to look good for Christianity, for following God, because they're going to have a backlash against the West, against missions, against the God of the Bible, right? And why are they trying to control? Why are missionaries? Why has Western missions for so long tried to control people? I'm sure there are lots of reasons, but a big reason that Alan highlights is fear, right? There's a fear that if we allow individual self-expression, if we allow people to have power, then their expression, they might get some things wrong, right? They might have some doctrinal flaws. They might not do things the way that we do. They might not see eye to eye with us. And in, maybe before Alan's time more so, but especially when the state and the church were a lot more hand in hand, a national expression of religion divorced from the expression from the missionaries, the Western missionaries of imperialistic nations, that's not very good for the nation. It's not good then for the religion, who is supported by the imperialistic nation. Why? Because religion has long been used as a method of control. And so we want to be able to control the people that we are trying to exploit. And religion at the hand of the state has certainly been used to do that, knowingly, and I'm sure also unwittingly by some people who thought that they were really doing good by God to have rigid structures set over nationals. Alan ends this chapter, I think, with a really powerful story. He basically, his analogy is, he tells the story of Satan, where Satan recognized that the power to fall is the power to rise, because in falling, there's a great power in redemption, in what is done to save. Right? Most movies, historically, most movies that are like hero movies and just the feel good movies, the happy ending movies where there's a protagonist, something goes wrong, there's this great calamity and or this great problem that needs to be solved, and or this great fall, if you want to call it, right? This hurdle, this obstruction, this enemy, whatever it is, and the story is basically about the protagonist overcoming that fall, overcoming that obstacle. And in the end, you feel so good, but you only feel so good because of the fall that came. Like, there's this tension and anxiety that you have, and how are they going to overcome this? And when they overcome it, you're like, yes, right? That moment of freedom, of relief, of accomplishment, of victory. And so Satan recognized that the power to fall is the power to rise. And so unwittingly, a lot of times, the missionaries historically have not recognized that they are actually on the side of Satan, because what they're trying to do is they are trying to prevent the fall, right? By seeking domineering control, constraint. And the Spirit doesn't work that way. The Spirit doesn't work by constraint. The Spirit and love, they don't work based on fear. They're not fearful. They're not fearful of the fall. Right? They are not fearful of the fall because they have the power to redeem. And it's a power, an unconstrained power that blows where it wills and that we cannot control. And that scares us. That scares a lot of people. That has scared missionaries historically. And so, rather than embrace the zeal of nationals, the Spirit unconstrained, and allow the Spirit to blow where it wills and as hard as it wills, we so often have sought to prevent the power to rise by preventing the fall, by micromanaging and trying to set things up so that nothing bad could happen in self-expression, not allowing nationals to have their own autonomy and self-expression, and allowing them to learn through failure, through their fall. So that's Alan's synopsis there. That's a synopsis of Alan's chapter 2. I really love his stuff, and I have such conflicting feelings about missions because I'm not so concerned about the economic waste per se. It's like I'm not going to judge things by inefficiency, right? I think that's I don't think that's a good way to judge things necessarily. At the same time, I think it is something to consider economically. Like, is this something that is unwise in the way that we're spending our money on missions? But more than that, it's how are we doing the missions, and why are we doing it? Are we objectifying people and just trying to go convert people? Or do we have a passion and a zeal that we want to share with other people in their own context, not trying to be imperialistic missionaries, but to go over and love and seek and serve? And I think that's largely not the case, in part because, at least with evangelical missions, they look so down on missions that seem to be heavy on the social justice side, right? They want converts. They want evangelism, not recognizing that to serve and to love, to have a love for neighbor, a love for other, that that itself is an emanation out of a love that God has for us and the gospel at work within us. And that right there, the social gospel, being forward with the social gospel and going and loving and serving and being with the poor and not even necessarily bringing up Jesus or the gospel for while you're serving. But that is an expression of love, whereas going and just trying to evangelize and trying to witness and save souls through some intellectual assent can actually be objectifying and unloving. There's a whole lot there. I know that I'm probably jumbling it up here in this short time. There's a lot that's going through my head, and it's way too much to say here in this space. But hopefully you get the gist of what Alan is trying to say. And this would probably be easier for me to have a conversation with you if you would like. So feel free to reach out to me. But if you want to dig more into my experience with missions and just some different ideas on what's okay and what's kind of wrong with it today still. I think we've shifted a lot. Like I said in the previous episode, I know that a lot of evangelical missions and ours in particular, our team in particular, we're very focused on raising up nationals. And that's something that's been huge. And I'm sure Alan was a big influence in that, where Like, we're not going to be the main upfront people teaching and speaking and all that. We want nationals to do that. We're there to serve and to assist, but like, we don't want to be the main people. So I think there's a lot of significant difference with missions today in general. Nevertheless, still probably a lot to be desired. So anyway, that was chapter 2 from Alan, and I'll be back next week with chapter 3.